Namaskar. Today we shall discuss the fourth part of the Aryan invasion theory, which we have been discussing for the last 3 weeks. Actually, all that we have discussed in 3 weeks is actually the first part, can be clubbed into a single section, where we discussed the colonial backdrop, the historical backdrop against which the Aryan invasion theory was born, grown, and sustained. It is the collective support of not only the historians, the scholars, but also the political leadership, the missionary activists, and the scholars, of course. But most of the scholars were working from a missionary angle only. Their target was to Christianize India. Even the political leadership divided into two sections, like one is the statesmen, the leaders of the public, and another is a set of administrators. All of them shared this motive of converting India to Christianity. Be it Wilberforce, or be it Macaulay, or among the scholars, be it Max Muller, or Professor Wilson, William Monier Williams, Reverend Rice, and among the politicians, the British leadership such as Stanley Baldwin, all these people at various points of time have seen this theory useful and supportive of their own motives, their own purposes. Therefore, it's sustained. However, there are several pertinent questions which we need to ask. The most important of that is the Indian perspective. This theory, what we have seen in the last sessions, was entirely enunciated and developed by the European scholarship and leadership. It did not take into account the Indian perspective at all. India was a country of something like 30 crores of people, 30 crores of people, having a history of more than 5,000 years, had an enormously large corpus of literature in Sanskrit and in other vernacular languages, including Tamil. In this entire corpus of literature, there is not one mention, not one, of our ancestors coming from outside India. How can this be ignored? If you say that it is not true, that they really did come from outside, then the burden of proof lies on those who make that kind of a theory. But this theory was hoisted upon India because we were under authority, and it sustained through the textbooks and through the parliament and the House of Commons, etc. So today we are proposing or presenting the Indian perspective upon this theory. So there are several sections which I would like to discuss. One is the few pertinent questions, the basis of these questions. Second is the history of Sanskrit literature. What does Sanskrit literature say about this, the word Arya? Does it refer to it as a race, or does it refer to it as something else? Then the Tamil literature. If Aryans had come from outside and drove the Dravidians southwards, is there not be some mention of that clash, that conflict of being driven away from the north to the south? What does the Tamil literature say on this? Then there are several scientific data, the geological data as well as other fields of science, which I have listed some of them. Totally some 8-10 files will give you the scientific data. Then what did our own sages, our own great scholars like Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, Baba Rao Ambedkar, these kind of scholars and sages, what did they say? And then we conclude.
ಅದು ನ್ಯೂಸಿಂದ ಒಳಗಡೆ ಇತ್ತಾಗಿ ಕ್ಲೀನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ಯಾ ಅದು ಇದು ತೆಗಿ ನಾರು.
Questions. The theory first. The theory says that around 1500 BC, hordes of semi-barbarian, mind you, they were not cultured people, they were nomadic people. They were not settled in one place. They were moving from one place to another place. And even today, their original place, if at all there was one, is not identified. Michel Danino lists something like 23 different places, but none of them is confirmed. So semi-barbarian, Sanskrit-speaking, pastoral nomads. Pastoral means people who graze their cattle. Nomads, a fair-skinned Aryans poured from Central Asia or thereabout, we don't know from where, into northwest India. The curious part is that once they entered India, they become highly cultured, they are very thoughtful, they are able to conceive the philosophy of the Upanishads, and they started writing Vedas in a very, very short time span. And they composed literature. And these pastoral nomads who poured into the northwest fought with the original inhabitants, the Dasyus. There is one word called Dasyu in the Vedas, which they have picked up, and they say they interpret it as referring to the Dravidians. The dark-skinned Dravidians, and drove them southwards. Whereas the Veda doesn't define them as Dravidians. The Aryans settled in the land of 7 rivers around the Sindhu river, where they composed the Vedas and Puranas and epics. The Ramayana and Mahabharata conjectured as the record of conflicts between the invading Aryans and the local Dravidians. And we all know in India that the Ramayana was earlier to Mahabharata. And even the value system of the society, the two sides, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, are quite different from the value system of the Ramayana. And in our tradition, we know that Ramayana is earlier to Mahabharata. But some of these theoreticians even conjectured that Mahabharata was fought in Kurukshetra. It is the first war between the Dravidians and the Aryans. And Ramayana's war was fought in Sri Lanka. It is a later war. So Ramayana must have occurred after Mahabharata. These kind of conjectures were proposed to sustain the theory, or in the light of the theory. However, the theory ran into trouble in 1921-22 when the archaeological excavations at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, 2 places on the banks of river Sindhu, indicated a well-developed Vedic civilization which appeared to belong to an earlier period, about 3000 BC or even earlier. This was in 1921-22. They could not say it is not Vedic. So the Aryan invasion theory ran into the first trouble in identifying the date of the Aryan invasion. In the 1980s, the American Landsat and French Spot satellites. The satellite photography revealed the ancient Saraswati river bed under the Thar desert. The river originated at the Shivalik mountains in Himachal Pradesh and met the Arabian Sea near Bharuch, Gujarat. The satellite pictures revealed over 1,200 settlements on either side of the Great River, clearly indicating a Vedic civilization earlier to 2000 BC. See, this is the photograph. I mean, this is an old photograph. It is, I think, 1996 or so, where the Sindhu River is marked. You can see the Sindhu River here. It has 7 rivers, Sapta Sindhu, they say, tributaries, and it flows into the Arabian Sea. However, beside that is the river bed of the Saraswati River, which can be identified based on the alluvial soil deposit upon the river bed. Alluvial soil means the soft soil which identifies the river bed, and at places it is very wide. It is as wide as 5 to 8 kilometers at places. And on either side of that, there is a crowding of these spots you see. These are all settlements. It is not confined only to the river bed, but upon the river bed, there are so many settlements. It is highly crowded settlements. Whereas if compared to that, the Sindhu River did not have so many settlements. You don't see the crowding around the Sindhu, but you see the crowding around Saraswati River. And this Saraswati River bed today, as on today, it may be at places, it is about 140 feet below the surface of the earth. So the archaeologists identify that this river was flowing until around 2000 BC, until about 2000 BC. And there were geographical reasons. Maybe the earth plate was moving, the bed was sinking, but water was not joining the river. And the water started flowing towards the Sindhu and the Yamuna. Both Sindhu and Yamuna became stronger and Saraswati dried up around 2000 BC. The drying did not happen overnight. It happened over a period of about 300 years, 3 centuries. So you would often see the settlements that are photographed are upon the river bed. Because as the sea of something like 8 kilometers shrinks to say 5 kilometers, then the settlements also move along the river bank. They will also come closer to each other on either side of the bank. So it looks as though it is upon the river bed. But eventually the river dried completely and the people migrated from this Saraswati bed to elsewhere. Some of them went to the east. They even reached Bengal. So this is the Saraswati River, which has been identified, to be existing about 2000 BC until 2000 BC. And if you see Ramayana has reference to the Saraswati River at least in 2 places. One of them is to say that Bharata crossed the river when Rama Pattabhisheka was announced, was not consummated, but announced, and Kaikeyi placed a demand and Rama had to go to the forest. Then Bharata was not in station at that time. He travels from Kekaya Desha. Kekaya Desha is somewhere here in Afghanistan. Takshashila, Kekaya and all that is somewhere here. From there, Bharata travels over a period of 7 days. He travels along this route and reaches Ayodhya in about 7 days. He traveled both days and nights, and Valmiki describes it with great detail, where he crossed a particular river, which village, etc., etc. All these details are mentioned by Valmiki. That is one reference to Saraswati. Another is Sugriva sends various teams in various directions to search for Sita, and he sends one team towards the Saraswati river bed. So these references are there in Valmiki Ramayana. That sustains our idea of Valmiki Ramayana is about 5000 BC. So it supports the argument that the river was present until 2000 BC. Thirdly, no evidence of any invasion. Invasion amounts to conflict. Conflict means there will be war and destruction. So these settlements which are seen do not have evidence of destruction. An invasion evidence is not there. Many skeletons were identified, hundreds of them, but none of them have broken bones. Therefore, the invasion theory came under suspicion, under question, and then the theorists, Aryan invasion theorists, they changed it to saying that it's a migration, not invasion. No evidence of any invasion, destruction caused by war or conflict has come to light so far in the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization. Its decline is because of the drying up of the river Saraswati around 2200 to 1900 BC due to natural geographical upheavals. Yeah. There were people who doubted the veracity of the theory right from the beginning. You know, the theory started around 1846. Clearly started around 1846. There was an earlier person who was proposed it, but then the formulation of the theory started with Max Muller, I would say, in a more concrete and more clear terms. It started around 1846 and he formulated it maybe around 1850s, 53, 54. More clearly he formulated it. But even at that time, when it was proposed, there are people who doubted the veracity of this theory on very solid reasoning. Mount Stuart Elphinston was the governor of Bombay, 1819 to 27, was a statesman historian. He later wrote a book on the history of India. He was aware of the kinship in language between Sanskrit and European tongues, but found the theory of their spread from a central point a gratuitous assumption. In the history of India, he observed, the book he wrote is History of India, in which he observed, neither the Vedas nor in any book of Indian origin is there any allusion to a prior residence of the ancestors of India out of India. There is no reason whatever for thinking that the Hindus ever inhabited any country but their present one. British scholar, this is Purgaiter. Purgaiter was a civil servant in India and spent about 30 years in India. He retired as the judge of the company, the East India Company. He later wrote a book. He was a writer, a historian. In 1921-22, when the Mohenjo-daro and Harappa came to light, he raised this question. There is a strong presumption in favor of Indian tradition. If anyone contests that tradition, the burden lies on him to show that it is wrong. If Indians feel that they were inhabiting inside Bharat all the time, if somebody questions that, they have to prove it. That's what he's saying. The Indian tradition knows nothing whatever of the Aryan invasion of India through the northwest. All this copious tradition was falsely fabricated, and the truth has been absolutely lost if the current theory is right. That is the Aryan invasion theory. Is that probable? If all this tradition is false, why, how, and in whose interest was it all fabricated? Why should Indians say that we did not come from outside, or never mention this as if it is a conspiracy? Why? This has to be explained. Now let us look at the Sanskrit literature, some examples taken from authentic sources. What does it say about Arya? The word Arya is used often in the Sanskrit literature, and it has a, it's a word in the dictionary of Sanskrit language, the Amarakosha. Yeah. Let us see what the literature says. Indian history is far more ancient than was imagined by Western scholars in the 19th century. In fact, we have seen this earlier, that they did not imagine that, this imagination of the earlier history, that is 3102 BC, the beginning of Kali Yugam, and the Indian culture, civilization existed even earlier to that. That was not questioned by the 18th century mathematicians, scientists, historians of Europe. But by 19th century, they started questioning that. The entire gamut of Indian literature, Sanskrit as well as vernacular languages, the Vedas, the Smritis, the Itihasa, the Kavya, Purana, Darshana, Jain and Buddhist literature, sweeping over 5,000 years of history, there is no reference at all of Aryans ever coming, invasion or migration from outside India. In Indian literature, the word Arya is used to mean a civilized gentleman. I'll show you examples of this. The Amarakosha defines it as Sabhya Sajjana Sadhavaha. This is the quote from the Amarakosha, which is a Sanskrit dictionary. The Indian Sanskrit dictionary, not the British Sanskrit dictionary, the original dictionary. Mahakula Kulinarya Sabhya Sajjana Sadhavaha. That is the meaning of the word Arya. One who hails from good family, of gentle behavior and demeanor, good-natured, and of righteous conduct. And if you see the Veda, this is Rig Veda, saying this giving this call, Krinvanto Vishwamaryam. In fact, this phrase, Krinvanto Vishwamaryam, is the motto of Arya Samaj. Swami Dayananda Saraswati, who founded the Arya Samaj during the 19th century, picked this phrase as the motto of the Arya Samaj movement. It comes from Rig Veda, 9th Mandala, 63rd Sutra. Indram Vardhanto Aptura Krinvanto Vishwamaryam Apadnanto Aravnaha. What does it mean? Enhancing own strength, manifesting divine qualities, ennoble the whole world, drive away the evil. This is the call of the Veda. When you say Krinvanto Vishwamaryam, you can't convert the entire world into a race. It is not a racial connotation at all. It is a cultural connotation. It is making people more civilized, hence the motto. Now, sage Vasishtha, he is a Vedic Rishi. In the Rig Veda, 7th Mandala of Rig Veda is attributed to Vasishtha as a Rishi. The Rishi of the Mandala, 7th Mandala, was Vasishtha. Rishi of the 2nd Mandala was Vishwamitra. 4th Mandala is Vamadeva, like this. All these Rishis were contemporaries of Sri Rama. And under the name of Vasishtha, there is a book called Yoga Vasishtha, which is probably one of the earliest available texts on Advaita Vedanta. It is a description of what transpired between Vasishtha and Sri Rama when Sri Rama became a little despondent and felt vairagya after his education. After his Gurukula education, he comes back and says that everything is Maya, and therefore, why should I take up this earthly activity of the kingdom, etc. Then Vishwamitra suggests to Vasishtha to convince Sri Rama about the necessity of his taking up the worldly life or the responsibilities. So this discussion is called Yoga Vasishtha, and it is very huge. It is 29,000 shlokas. If you remember, Valmiki Ramayana is about 24,000 shlokas, but Yoga Vasishtha is larger than that. It has 458 sargas, that is chapters. So in the Yoga Vasishtha, Vasishtha defines the meaning of the word Arya. He says, Kartavyam acharan karma, akartavyam anacharan, tishtati prakritachare, sava arya iti smritaha. He speaks on behalf of the Indian scriptures, smritaha. This is what the scriptures say, says Vasishtha. And he says, who is the one who is responsible for his duty? Kartavyam acharan karma, akartavyam anacharan. What you should not do, he will not do. That means he is a restrained person, he is a cultured person, he is a responsible person. One who performs his duties diligently and refrains from doing improper things. One who keeps a distance from sins is an Arya, says the scriptures. Say the scriptures. That is Vasishtha's definition. Let us see what Valmiki says. Valmiki uses this word Arya at several places very freely. In the very first chapter, where Narada describes the entire story or narrates the entire story, it's called Shata Shloki Ramayana. In the first chapter itself, there are 100 shlokas. In the 100 shlokas, Narada narrates the entire Ramayana to Valmiki so that he can undertake the writing of Ramayana. So in that, he refers to Sri Rama and describes Sri Rama as a character. There are several adjectives he uses. Some of them are in these two shlokas. Sarva Shastra Artha Tattvajno Smritiman Pratibhanavan Sarvaloka Priya Sadhu Adinatma Vichakshana Sarvada Abhigata Sadbhi Samudra Iva Sindhubhi Arya Sarva Samaschaiva Sadaiva Priyadarshina. This is the description of the word Arya. He is learned in scriptures, Sarva Shastrartha Tattvajno, of exceptional memory, that is Smritiman, quick-wit, popular, gentle, dignified, and judicious. Like all rivers naturally flow into the ocean, good people naturally go to him for everything. Upright and noble, that is Arya. He is impartial to all. And therefore, people are always happy to meet him. Sadaiva Priyadarshina. That is the meaning of Arya according to Valmiki. Again, he uses the word several places in the negative sense. Anarya he uses. And when he uses that Anarya, it is a condemnation. It is an abuse. Look at what he says when Sri Rama comes to Dasharatha and Kaikeyi in their palace and asked why Dasharatha is mourning. Why is he sorrowful? Why is he not talking to me? Then Dasharatha does not speak because he did not know what to say, because he had already announced the coronation of Rama and he came to announce it to Kaikeyi, and Kaikeyi threw up a tantrum and demanded the two boons which Dasharatha had promised her ages ago. And out of that, she demands that he should go to the forest. Rama should go to the forest. But Dasharatha doesn't have a voice to say this to Rama. So Sri Rama comes and asks, tell me, what does the king desire of me? I promise to obey his wishes. Rama does not speak with a forked tongue. Rama dvir na abhibhashate, he says. Then Kaikeyi says, this is the words of actually Valmiki. Valmiki says that tam arjava samayuktam. Arjava means integrity. Satyavadinam. Sri Rama, who is upright, arjava and truthful, Satyavadinam. That wretched Kaikeyi, Anarya Kaikeyi, Uvacha Ramam Kaikeyi Vachanam Bhrusha Darunam. Daruna means cruel words she hurled at him, he says, and he describes Kaikeyi as Anarya. This he does several times. This is the worst word abuse which Valmiki uses. Generally, Valmiki doesn't intervene in the narration and he is restrained. He is a rishi. His language is very balanced, but here he uses the word Anarya to Kaikeyi and he uses it repeatedly at several other places as well. And then the 2 chapters later he says, Tat apriyam anaryaya avachanam daruna udaram. He says that after hearing those harsh words from the wretch, that is Kaikeyi, an unruffled Rama addressed Kaikeyi with the following words. Anaryaya Kaikeyi. That is the word. And then a little later, upon hearing Rama's words, his father, stricken by deep sorrow, overcome by grief, he was unable to speak. With tears flowing, he wailed loudly. But Rama, exuding great radiance, Mahadyutihi, that's how he describes Rama, Mahadyutihi. Rama prostrated at the feet of his father, who was unconscious or at least prostrate, and also at the feet of that ignoble Kaikeyi. This word ignoble comes from Valmiki, not Sri Rama. Sri Rama prostrates before her. Anaryaya Kaikeya. Cha api, even her, he says. Even that wretched Kaikeyi, Sri Rama prostrated and came out of the palace. At another place, Sri Rama uses this word Anaryam. It is when, after this encounter, Rama goes to Kausalya's palace and tells her that this is the situation. I have decided to go to the forest. Kausalya naturally cries, begs him not to do that, and says that I am your mother, he is your father, but mother is greater than the father. Listen to me, she says. Don't go. And if at all you are going, take me also with you. And Lakshmana arrives there, angry, furious, and he says to Rama, instigated by the wicked Kaikeyi, if our father turns around and becomes an enemy, then I would not hesitate to arrest and detain him, and if necessary, kill him, he says. Vadhyatam api. If I am constrained to do that, I will do that also. he says. Then Sri Rama rebukes Lakshmana. Mildly, of course, but he tells him that this is not the way of Aryans. This is not the way of an Arya. Tat enam visrija anaryam kshatra dharmashritam matim. He says that, therefore, O Lakshmana, forgo this ignoble adventurism. Anaryam kshatra dharmashritam. That is, banking on your military prowess, you intend to do all this. This is anarya. Take refuge in dharma alone, not on harsh measures. I always follow the path shown by my light. Mad buddhir anugamyata. So follow dharma. So anarya is something exactly opposite to that of dharma. That's how Ramayana describes it. Then Rama goes to the forest, spends up 14 years there. Sita was abducted by Ravana. Rama crosses over to Lanka and there was a fierce battle. Then finally Rama kills Ravana. And at that time, Valmiki describes that the wives of Ravana, they emerged from the palace through the northern gate, he says. The war field was on the northern side of the Lanka palace, and they're emerging out of that. The many wives of Ravana, they come to the war front seeking the body of Ravana. And they cry. What do they cry? Aryaputreti, Natheti, Aryaputra. They cry for Ravana saying Aryaputra. So Ravana is addressed as Aryaputra by his wives. It is not a racial connotation at all. So the Dravidian movement thinks that Ravana was a Dravid king, which is distinct from Aryan. Whereas here is evidence of Valmiki Ramayana where the wives of Ravana address him as Aryaputra. Looking for the dead husband, weeping and wailing aloud, O Aryaputra, O my Lord. Aryaputreti ha natheti. They are all surrounded, the headless body on the ground, soiled with blood. That was Ramayana. Now, what did Mahabharata say? In the Mahabharata, in the Udyoga Parva, that is the fifth kanda, fifth book of Mahabharata, when the Sandhi Prastapa was going on, when Sanjaya had gone to the Pandava barracks and had held discussions with the Yudhishthira and came back and reported, then Dhritarashtra feels a little uncertain and he calls for Vidura. Vidura comes and then Dhritarashtra asks him about the duties and responsibilities of a king, and Vidura narrates him over a long chapter. This is known as Vidura Niti. Vidura Niti. In the Vidura Niti, almost at the end, Vidura describes the meaning of the word Arya. Arya Sheelam is the word used. Paramahurarya, that is the word used. Okay. So he says, one who does not reopen a closed wound, one who is not vain and arrogant, one who avoids overindulgence in sensory pleasures, one who does not delight in others' suffering, one who does not regret after giving gifts is said to be of noble character. He is called Arya Sheela. Please note the adjective, Arya Sheela. It is an attribute. It is not a racial connotation at all. In the Indian tradition, there is no connotation to mean that Arya is a race. And a little later, during the war, Sri Krishna advises Arjuna in the form of Bhagavad Gita, and the very first sentence of Sri Krishna, when Arjuna says that I will not fight, and he just sits down in the chariot. He keeps his bow aside and sits down. Then Krishna says, Kutastva kashmalamidam vishame samupasthitam anarya jushtam aswargyam akirtikaram Arjuna. From where did this muck arise in your mind, O Arjuna? At this most inopportune moment, Kutastva kashmalamidam vishame samupasthitam anarya jushtam. He says, it is unbecoming of a noble person. Cultured, responsible, Kshatriya you are, and a king. He should not behave like this at all. Anarya Jushtam says. Will deny you the high heavens and the most ignominious indeed, and is most ignominious indeed, he says. Anarya Jushtam Aswargyam Akirtikaram Arjuna. Coming to Gautama Buddha, a few centuries later, Gautama, that Buddha, defines the word Arya. Natena Aryo hoti yena pranani himsati. He says, the one who indulges in hurtful behavior to all lives, pranani himsati, he is not an Arya. That is Buddha's definition. Ahimsa sava prananam aryoti pavuchati. This is in Pali language. It is a derivative from Sanskrit. As you see, it can be very easily seen. This is from Dharmapada of Bhagavan Buddha. One who causes violence to beings is not an Arya, he says. Not a racial connotation at all. There is a statement in the Veda about the Dasyu, about the word Dasyu used in the Rig Veda to mean barbarian. Akarma Dasyurabhi. See, it doesn't talk about race at all. It says Akarma. The one who indulges in bad karma, he is a Dasyu. Amantura. Anyavrato Amanushaha. Lawless, rightless, barbarous and inhuman. Amanushaha. That is a Dasyu. It doesn't have a racial connotation. This is about Sanskrit and Pali. But then what about Tamil literature? I'm quoting this from Michel Danino, who has written this book, The Invasion That Never Was. A small book, about 100 pages, worth reading. He quotes from Shilappadikaram. There are epics in the south. One is Shilappadikaram and another is Manimekhalai. So the Shilappadikaram, 1st or 2nd century BC. It is not very clear whether it is really 1st or 2nd century BC, because the European scholarship always thought that if it is very old, they would classify it as 1st century BC. Whether it is 1st century or 6th century or 10th century, it's all clubbed together and called 1st century BC. The Shilappadikaram relates the beautiful and tragic story of Kannagi and Kovalan. It opens with invocations to Chandra, Surya and Indra, all of them Vedic gods, and frequently mentions Shiva, Subramanya, Vishnu and Krishna. When Kovalan and Kannagi are married, they walk around the holy fire, a typically Vedic rite still at the center of Hindu wedding. The 7 steps taken around the fire. There is also a reference to the Vedic sacrifices, that is yajnas, being faultlessly performed. Welcomed by a tribe of fierce hunters on their way to Madurai, they witness a striking apparition of Durga, who is addressed equally as Lakshmi and Saraswati. There are countless references to legends from the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the Puranas in Shilappadikaram. The Chera king Shenguttavan, on his way to Himalayas in search of a stone for Kannagi's idol, worships at two temples, one of Shiva and one of Vishnu. The European scholarship would say that the south is Shiva, the north is Vishnu, whereas Shenguttavan worships in both. After battling a few northern kings and obtaining the stone, he bathes in the Ganga. In fact, the waters of Ganga and those of Kaveri were said to be equally sacred. We are aware that the Vedic hymn says, Gange cha Yamune chaiva Godavari Saraswati Narmade Sindhu Kaveri Jalesmin Sannidhin Kuru. So it starts from Ganga but then ends up mentioning Kaveri. The archaeologist K.V. Raman, who excavated many sites in Tamil Nadu, summarizes the religious inheritance of the Pandyas, the Tamil kings. Says Sri Raman, the Pandyan kings were great champions of the Vedic religion from the very early times. According to the Sinnamannur plates, the copper plates found in Sinnamannur, one of the early Pandyan kings performed 1,000 Velvi or yagas. Though the majority of the Pandyan kings were Shaivites, they extended equal patronage to other faiths and included invocatory verses to the Hindu Trinity, that is Brahma, Vishnu, Maheshwara, uniformly in all their copper plate grants. The Pandyas patronized all the 6 systems or the schools of Hinduism, the Shat Darshanas. Their religion was not one of narrow sectarian nature, but broad-based with Vedic roots. They were free from linguistic or regional bias, took pride in saying that they considered Tamil and Sanskritic studies as complementary and equally valuable. This is ancient Tamil Nadu. And what about the later Nayanmars and Alvar saints? One is the Vaishnava saints, another is the Shaiva saints. With their thousands of devotional hymns and their frequent evocations of the Veda. This is a quote from Sri Aurobindo, who translated what Andal was a saint, said, those whose voices are blessed, they sang the Vedic songs. To utter the Vedic mantra purifies your tongue. That's what it means. And this is from a Tamil saint. Now the geographical data, I started showing you this earlier, Saraswati River. Today we have no great river called Saraswati flowing through the region. Thanks to archaeology and satellite photography, we now know that the Saraswati gradually became weaker and finally dried up completely around 1900 or 2000 BC. Archaeological sites dating to that period have been found on the riverbed itself, indicating that the river must have been dry by the time they were established. That is, settlements were established after the river became dry. The riverbed became partially dry. The date of settlement, therefore, serves as the lower limit for the date of drying up of the river. This is fully confirmed by Vakankar's great exploration. Vakankar was an archaeologist. Before 2000 BC, long before, as it turns out, there was a great river that used to flow through Haryana, Punjab, and Rajasthan, emptying into the Arabian Sea near Bhubaneswar, which is called Bharuch today. Confirmed by photographs taken by the American satellite Landsat and later by the French satellite Spot. This was Saraswati, indeed a mighty river then, having a constant width of 6 to 8 kilometers, extending in places to 14 kilometers. It is wider than the Ganga today. Pakistani archaeologists Durrani and Mughal located more than 300 Harappan sites in the old Bhavalpur region. American archaeologist Mark Kenoyer in 1991 provided a detailed archaeological map of the whole northwest India that showed the greatest concentration of the sites along the course of Saraswati River. This is Saraswati, this is Sindhu. This is Saraswati and this is Sindhu. The Rig Veda, in the Rig Veda, Ganga is mentioned only once. Saraswati is lauded no less than 50 times. What does this mean? This means that during the Rigvedic period, Saraswati was a very dominant river. There is at least one whole hymn devoted to Saraswati. In a famous hymn, Shaunaka, the seer of the second mandala of Rigveda, lauds Saraswati as Ambi Tame, Nadi Tame, Devi Tame, Saraswati. The greatest of mothers, the best of rivers, the most benevolent goddess, etc. The Saraswati comes falling, crushing, nourishing, supporting, and cleansing. She moves like a juggernaut. This supreme revered water goes to the other ocean. That is from Rigveda. 7th mandala Rigveda. According to the 7th mandala of Rigveda, attributed to the famous Rishi Vasishtha, the Saraswati was a mighty stream that flowed from the mountain to the sea, sustaining the lives of the Vedic people. Says Rigveda, this river Saraswati, with her fostering current, comes forth. She is our sure defense, our fort of iron. As on a chariot, the flood flows on, surpassing the majesty and might of all other waters. Pure in her stream, from the mountain to the sea, filled with bounteous abundance for the worlds, nourishing with her flow the children of Nahusha. Children of Nahusha are the rulers of Kurukshetra. Pargaiter, I referred to him earlier, was an Indian civil servant, retired as a judge, but became a historian. Went even further, for he was convinced that Indian tradition clearly recorded an outflow of people from India before the 15th century BC. Not the inflow, but the direction of flow is outwards. And thought that the Iranians may have been an offshoot from India. There is a support for this argument because the Iranians would think, that is the Persians, I'm referring to the Persians. Today, Iranians and Muslims, they don't have a history before Muhammad Paigambar. They don't recognize it. Whereas the Parsis do, And if you ask the Parsis, where was the origin of mankind? Where did they come from? They will say they have come from Himalayas. So Purgator says that the people of Iran may have been an offshoot from India. He pertinently observed in the famous Nadi Sukta of the Rig Veda lists rivers of the subcontinent from the east to the west. The counting in the shloka is Ganga, Yamuna, Saraswati, Shutadri, Parushni. Hear my tribute. Imam me stomam sachata. Listen to my call. Askini Murudvrida Vitastha and Arjikiya Sushomo, etc. He says that the counting is from the east to the west. Therefore, the migration could have been from east to the west. That is Purgator's thesis. Now let us look at the scientific data. A US archaeologist, Schoffer, with first-hand experience of Harappan sites, who in 1984 article entitled Indo-Aryan Invasions, Myth or Reality, gave possibly the first thorough refutation of the invasion framework, calling for a critical re-evaluation of earlier linguistic interpretation. The earlier interpretation was based on the language. They said that Sanskrit had commonalities with Greek and Latin and European languages. Several words are common, so they must have had a common mother language, the Proto-Aryan language. That was the theory, based on philology, based on linguistics. He said that this is not adequate. We need to look at other branches of science apart from the language. Current archaeological data do not support the existence of Indo-Aryan or European invasion into South Asia any time in the pre or proto-historic periods. Invasion did happen in the modern times, in the colonial period, not before. The French archaeologist Jarrigue, who had led excavations at Mehergar, Nausharo, and Perak, three crucial sites at the foot of the Bolan Pass, Khyber and Bolan Pass, examined some of the important changes that took place at the end of the mature phase of the Indus Valley civilization. He found that none of those important transformations can be explained in the context of invasions of semi-nomadic peoples coming from the Central Asian steppes. Nothing in the present state of archaeological research enables us to reconstruct convincingly invasions that could be clearly attributed to Aryan groups. This is inadequate. Skeletons were found in Mohenjo-daro sites. A large number of skeletons found in a place could be indicative of battle or invasion related to mass death. However, Professor Dales of Berkeley University has shown that the human skeletons of Mohenjo-daro comes from different mud layers which got deposited by repeated floods in the river and were not due to the result of a single event such as a war. As many as 325 skeletons found in the excavations have been examined by anthropologists. The skeletons do not belong to any of the postulated racial types such as Mongoloid or Nordics and Mediterranean. The cephalic index shows that the skeletons found in Mohenjo-daro are like those of modern residents of Sindh, and those in Lothal are like those of modern residents of Gujarat, not outsiders. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, 1998 edition, the designation race has been applied to language groups. The Aryan race, even Professor Max Muller started saying this at the later part of his life, that I don't mean it in any other sense except the people who speak a specific language. So the race has been applied to language groups, national groups, religious groups, and the entire species of human, like the human race, but these usages are biologically and scientifically meaningless. It has no sense whatever, the race. To quote Posel, race as it was used in the 19th and early 20th centuries has been totally discredited as a useful concept in human biology. There is no reason to believe today that there ever was an Aryan race that spoke Indo-European languages and was possessed with a coherent and well-defined set of Aryan or Indo-European cultural features, like long nose, wide forehead. This kind of descriptions to indicate a race is meaningless. Kennedy, who made a detailed examination of skeletons at the number of Harappan sites, says, what the biological data demonstrate is that no exotic races are apparent from laboratory studies of human remains excavated from any archaeological sites. No special races. All prehistoric human remains recovered thus far from the Indian subcontinent are phenotypically identifiable as ancient South Asians. In short, there is no evidence of demographic disruptions in the northwestern sector of the subcontinent during and immediately after the decline of the Harappan culture. Harappan culture belongs to at least 3000 BC. He says neither during or immediately after, certainly not in 1500 BC. Now the astronomical data, that is from the Vedas, as a number of scholars have shown, the Vedic symbolism clearly refers to celestial events such as solstices and equinoxes, which can be dated between 4000 to 6000 BC. An Indian astronomer, B.G. Siddharth, finds in the Krishna Yajurveda a clear reference to the solstices around 8500 BC. Notice 8500 BC is earlier to Ramayana period, which we have been proposing, 5000 BC. So it is earlier to that, which would of course make the Rig Veda older than that. As the Brahmanas and Sutras, which followed the Veda, they yield dates in the vicinity of 3000 BC. It is difficult to say whether the Brahmanas were later or earlier. You cannot conclude from that. But the references are as old as 8500 BC. A second point in the discovery by the 18th century European astronomers like Jean Bailly or John Playfair of tables of astronomical positions still in use by Hindu astrologers. The starting date of those tables was about 4300 BC, and Playfair proved mathematically that it could not have been fabricated. Playfair, perhaps it is not correct to say proved, but Playfair gave a reasonable argument that it is not fabricated. Because he said, unless it is an actual observation, to make it project it backwards now in the 19th century or 18th century, project it backwards, we need mathematics, which was not known at that time. So Indians don't have that mathematics when the Europeans had it. So they could not have projected it backwards and said that this is the how the sky looked in 4300 BC. That's what Playfair said. Voltaire too reported in 1773 similar observations by Le Gentil, a French astronomer who spent several years in India and who, with admiration, acknowledged the Brahmins' science, as well as the immensity of time these Indians must have needed to reach a knowledge of which even the Chinese never had any notion, and which was unknown to Egypt and Chaldea, the teacher of Egypt. So said Le Gentil, quoted by Voltaire. Now the last but one part, what about the Indian sages? What did Swami Vivekananda say on this? It is surprising that Swami Vivekananda has pronounced on several fields and with great insight. You may please look at a small book titled as India and Her Problems, in which it's a compilation of what Vivekananda said on various aspects of Indian society and her problems. Suggested solutions to many of them, which appear so insightful today. Swami Vivekananda once asserted, wherever the Europeans find an opportunity, they exterminate the aborigines and settle down in ease and comfort on their lands. The European colonies were established in South America, in North America, in Australia, in Africa, and also in Asia. Wherever they went, they exterminated the aborigines in large numbers, and settled down in ease and comfort on their lands. And therefore, they conclude that the Aryans must have done the same. But where is your proof? Is it a guesswork? Then keep your fanciful ideas to yourselves. In what Veda, in what Sukta do you find that the Aryans came into India from a foreign country? Where do you get the idea that they slaughtered the wild aborigines? And what do you get by talking such nonsense? Our European archaeologist dreams of India being full of dark-eyed aborigines, and the bright Aryans came from Lord knows where, from Europe, of course. Sometimes they say it is central Tibet, sometimes say it is central India, sometimes they say the Swiss lakes, some say now that they lived at the North Pole. Lord bless the Aryans and their habitations. As for the truth of these theories, there is not one word in our scriptures, not one, to prove that the Aryans ever came from anywhere outside India. And in ancient India was included Afghanistan as well. There it ends. And the theory that the Shudra castes were non-Aryans is equally illogical and equally irrational. The whole of India is Aryan and nothing else. Sri Aurobindo wrote in 1910, as early as 1910, before the Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were excavated. He said, in India, we have fallen during the last few centuries into a fixed habit of unquestioning deference to the alien authority, European authority. We are ready to accept all European theories, the theory of Aryan colonization of Dravidian India, the theory of nature worship of the Vedic rishis, as if these hazardous speculations were on par in authority and the certainty with the law of gravitation. Scientific theories are acceptable, but these imaginations and assumptions are not acceptable. But we have fallen into that trap. Said Aurobindo, so great is the force of attractive generalizations and widely popularized errors that the world goes on perpetuating the blunder, talking of Indo-European races, claiming or disclaiming Aryan kinship, and building on that basis of falsehood the most far-reaching political, social, or pseudo-scientific conclusions. How prophetic if we consider that this was written some 20 years before the growth of Nazism in its claim on the Aryan kinship. You will be aware that the Nazi movement was based on the Aryan race theory. The Nazis felt that they are the descendants of the Aryan race and it is their monopoly to be superior in blood, in skin, in intelligence. Sri Aurobindo called on Indians not to be haunted by the unfortunate misconstruction of the Veda, which European scholarship has imposed on the modern mind. Study it for yourself and formulate your own opinions. The indications of the Veda on which the theory of a recent Aryan invasion is built are very scanty, are very scanty quantity and uncertain in their significance. There is no actual mention of such an invasion in the whole of Vedas. The Vedic indications of a racial division between Aryans and Dasyus and the identification of the latter with the indigenous Indians are of a far flimsier character than I had supposed. There is no reliable indication of any racial difference. Sri Aurobindo's study of Tamil, which he did with the help of Subramanya Bharati, the poet Subramanya Bharati, led him to discover that the original connection between Sanskrit and Tamil tongues was far closer and more extensive than is usually supposed, and that they were two divergent families derived from the lost primitive tongue. Said Sri Aurobindo, in my study of Tamil words had brought me what seemed a clue to the very origins and structure of the ancient Sanskrit tongue. In fact, tradition says that the Panini prayed to the Lord Shiva and Shiva appeared before him, pleased with his tapasya, Panini's tapasya, and he shook his drum and Panini listened to it and formulated the initial sutras of his Ashtadhyayi. There are 14 sutras which are known as Maheshwara Sutrani. And it is said on one side Panini heard it, and on the other side Agastya heard it, and Agastya formulated the Tamil language and Panini formulated the Sanskrit language. This is the legend of Panini. Now Aurobindo says that there must have been having a common source. The racial identification of supposed Aryans and non-Aryans, which Orientalists try to squeeze out of the Veda, was therefore a conjecture supported only by other conjectures. A conjecture is a hypothesis, a conjecture supported by other conjectures. A myth of philologists. I am indeed disposed to doubt whether there was ever any such entity in India as a separate Aryan or a separate Dravidian race, said Sri Aurobindo in 1914. Now, this is what Dr. Ambedkar said. Ambedkar made a study of this theory and wrote a book. The theory of invasion is an invention. Theory of invasion is an invention, said Dr. Ambedkar. This invention is necessary because of gratuitous assumption that the Indo-Germanic people, gratuitous means without adequate rationale, without reasonable basis, that the Indo-Germanic people are the purest of the modern representatives of the original Aryan race. The theory is based upon nothing but pleasing assumptions and inference based on such assumptions. He's echoing what Sri Aurobindo said, conjectures based upon conjectures. He said here is assumptions based upon assumptions. The theory is a perversion of scientific investigation. It is not allowed to evolve out of facts. On the contrary, the theory is preconceived and the facts are selected to prove it. It falls into the ground at every point. And B.R. Ambedkar's conclusions are, the Vedas do not know any such race as the Aryan race or the Dravidian race. There is no evidence in the Vedas of any invasion of India by the Aryan race and its having conquered the Dasas or the Dasyus, supposed to be the natives of India. There is no such evidence. There is no evidence to show that the distinction between Aryans, Dasas and Dasyus was a racial distinction. In fact, people who do bad karma are called Dasyus. People who do good karma are called Aryans. The Vedas do not support the contention that the Aryans were different in color from the Dasas or the Dasyus. If you remember, Krishna and Rama are supposed to be dark in color, and Draupadi was supposed to be dark in color. Veda Vyasa was supposed to be dark in color. So color is not the basis of distinction. If anthropometry is a science which can be depended upon to determine the race of a people, establish that the Brahmins and untouchables belong to the same race. From this, it follows that if the Brahmins are Aryans, the untouchables are also Aryans. If the Brahmins are Dravidians, the untouchables are also Dravidians. So let us conclude. I have 3 foils on conclusion. The entire range of Indian literature, from the Vedas down to all scriptures, Puranas, epics, in all Indian languages, including Tamil, do not contain any reference to the Aryan invasion or migration from outside India. Nor do they contain any memory of forcible movement from north to the south India. The Vedic homeland is variously termed as Aryavarta, Bharatavarsha, Bharatakanda, Jambu Dvipa, etc. Nowhere has it been identified with any spot or place outside India. The Vedic homeland, Bharatavarsha, Bharatakande, Jambu Dvipa, not outside India. The Vedas and Sanskrit were respected across the country, including the south. The southern kings the Karikala Chola, the Pandya king Nedun Chelian were followers of Vedic tradition, performed Vedic yajnas. The Pallava capital Kanchi was a great center of Sanskrit literature, Sanskrit learning, Sanskrit studies. The Harappan civilization or the Sindhu Saraswati civilization, not only Sindhu Saraswati civilization was Vedic civilization. No evidence of invasion has been found in the ruins. Ample archaeological evidence is available on the existence of Saraswati River before 2000 BC. More than 1200 sites have been identified on either side of the river Saraswati, not just on the bank, but on an extended land on either side of Saraswati River, which declined because of the drying up of the river Saraswati around 2000 BC. No specific spot in Central Asia or Europe has been identified as the original home of the Aryans. From where and why, where, when and why they had started migrating. What was the motivation for migration? None of them are answered. There are supposed to be some 23 different places which are connected with Aryan origin or the thesis of Aryan origin. The Aryan invasion theory originated in the assumption of inherent superiority of the white race over the brown-skinned people. It thrived and survived as it was useful to sustain the British rule in India by providing moral justification for the British occupation of India. He said that you are also Aryans only. We are also Aryans. You had come earlier, now we have come. So don't ask us to get out. Jiska lati uska bhains. Today we are more powerful, so we will rule. So why do you complain? You too did the same thing. That kind of a moral justification. Dividing the Indian society on invader aborigine lines create an intrinsic division in the society as Aryans and Dravidians, upper caste and lower caste, Sanskrit language and Tamil language, like that. So dividing the Indian society. The support of Macaulay's intellectual offsprings, they feel convinced that Aryans have come from outside. When the invasion theory failed, they brought in the migration theory and keep on repeating it. And the NCERT has brought it into the school textbooks, which still remains there. Yeah, so that is the conclusion of this presentation. If there are any questions or comments, I would like to hear.
Hello? Yeah. Thank you, sir. So now the session is open for any comments or questions. 1 second. Anybody having any questions? Okay, sir. So since no questions or comments.
No comments. There is a tidbit wish to hear. It is a tidbit picked from N.S. Rajaram's book, History. He's talking about Max Muller's historiography. He says that the theory is so full of holes, it cannot hold any water. So look at the way Max Muller's logic worked initially. Later on, of course, he corrected and he matured. He stood aside from the theory, but at one point, he said this, looking at the dates given, this is what N.S. Rajaram says, one cannot fail to be struck by the extraordinary symmetry of the dates assigned by Max Muller. The evidence cited by him was no less extraordinary. His principal witness was a character in a ghost story found in the collection of fairy tales written by Somadeva of Kashmir in 1060 AD. Somadeva wrote a collection of stories. From the stories, Max Muller adduced some support to his theory. In this story, it is not history, it is a story. In a story written to entertain Suryavati, wife of King Ananta of Kashmir, by Somadeva, in the story, a one-eyed ghost by name Kanabhuti claims that the character Vararuchi is referred to by the story. Who was Vararuchi? Vararuchi was a minister in the Magadhan Empire. Magadhan ruler Nanda. That is before 326. There were 8 ministers, and one of them was Vararuchi of Dhanananda. And when is Somadeva writing it? And 1370 years later, 75 years later, he is writing a story and he refers to Vararuchi in a story. Was a reincarnation of a certain Katyayana. He said Vararuchi is a reincarnation. Now, which Katyayana? We do not know. By a bold leap of imagination, Max Muller identified this Katyayana with a Vedic commentator from the Sutra period. There are 7 acharyas known. One of them is Katyayana by name. So he says that same Katyayana must have reborn as Vararuchi in 350 BC and concluded that he was the contemporary of Nanda. Vararuchi is a reincarnation, not Katyayana himself. But Max Muller concluded that Vararuchi is Katyayana himself and is a contemporary of Katyayana, was a contemporary of Nanda. Since Nanda was thought to have ruled in the 4th century BC, Max Muller assigned the Sutra literature to the period around Nanda. In the 19th century, this is the kind of history they wrote about India. Was it scientific? Was it scientific at all? In the 19th century. And they comment, Macaulay's comment, absurd history, absurd philosophy, absurd science, everything absurd in India. And they are referring to what Valmiki wrote 7,000 years ago. 7,000 years ago, Europe did not exist as a continent. They did not know what to do with their hands and what to do with their feet. Yeah. But in 19th century, these are claimed, this is the kind of logic they used to sustain a theory, and it's sustained not because of facts, not because of logic, not because of sound theory, but because of other reasons, such as the political reason, the religious reason, and the colonial interests. Okay, that is about the Aryan invasion theory.
Okay, sir. Nagi, any question or comment?
Yeah. Just since there was no question, I just decided to ask one question. Sir, my question is with regarding to your last comment when you're about to close the slide. So you said that it has been continued by NCERT, right? So I wanted to know, is that confirmed? Because I have asked a couple of my teacher friends to verify that. But unfortunately, most schools are closed, so there is difficulty in getting that information. So I wanted to check your opinion on that.
See, I have not recently seen NCERT guidelines. I have not seen. However, However, I have studied this Aryan invasion theory in my school.
Agreed, yeah.
That is post-independent schooling.
Yeah.
And it has been a contention, very, very hotly contested by the NCERT group of people, historians. Any removal of this, any alteration to the theory was, I think it is very hotly contested. That is why when Aryan invasion has failed, they said it is migration. You can go to Rumila Thapar's statement on this. She said it is a migration. So this group is very influential and has been controlling the NCERT, has maintained this Aryan invasion theory in the NCERT books. I don't know whether the latest textbook contains it, whether the government has put an axe to that, but I expect that if government has changed it, there will be an uproar.
Okay. Thank you.
But if you ask me whether I have seen it recently, I have not. So I cannot.
Yeah, that is true. Nagi, in the last few years, 3-4 years, if the changes happened, it cannot be confirmed. But at least 4-5 years back, it was still
Yeah,
there.
my only thing is, if at all we know, yeah, if we know some teachers, some anyone, right, at least we can get it confirmed. I've been trying to, because of this COVID thing, it's been very difficult to access such information.
Yeah.
So it is possible, right, Nagi, because they would have removed it silently also in the last 3-4 years. Otherwise, there will be unnecessary uproar in the country.
Okay.
But until 2016, I can confirm. 2015, 2016, it was still there. In fact, I have given one Quora reference in the chat window where they are discussing.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, then let us conclude.
There is one question from Satyabodha Kulkarni, sir.
Yeah. Yes.
Sir, namaste, sir.
Namaste.
Namaste, sir. Sorry, a couple of your lectures I could not attend previous. There was some shift from WhatsApp to this Telegram. I could not do that immediately. Sir, it's not a question, it's just a concern. You have quoted a lot of references here for this fallacy of this theory, and was there any record of any resistance that time happening to this theory, or any such record in any of these references? I don't think it would have been accepted as it is. People would not have been convinced even that time also.
Which time you are referring to?
The theory, entire Aryan invasion theory, when it was proposed by Max Muller, there could have been some resistance. The people would not have accepted it as it is. There could have been some resistance to this, accepting this.
I have quoted at the very beginning of today's lecture, I have quoted two sources where there was opposition to this from the British scholars themselves. Both of them are British. Mount Stuart Elphinston, who was the governor of Bombay in 1819 to 27, he was a governor. And this theory came around 1846, 1850, that period. So he opposed it in his book, The History of India, which was written around 1850. So there was an opposition on that. And then British scholar Purgator, he wrote in 1922 that this is stupid and meaningless. So there was opposition.
There was opposition, yes.
In fact,
thank you, sir.
Let's talk about opposition. Max Muller himself withdrew his position
Later,
in 1883. And very strongly he withdrew. And later in his autobiography, written in 1900, published after his death in 1900, he said, see, this Indian, the Vedas could not have been later than 5000 BC, he said. We require a very large time span to develop the thought process of the Veda. It is
Yes.
not an overnight affair. It is not a century affair. It is millennia affair.
Yes.
He said it would have been fine. And if Vedas were 5,000 years old, then what about Sanskrit? He himself asked this question. See, any development in thought requires a language.
Language, yes.
So without a language, you cannot communicate, you cannot develop a thought system.
Yeah.
So he says Sanskrit must have been earlier. And the Sanskrit is so mature a language, Panini is Ashtadhyayi. We really don't know what is the time of Panini.
Yes.
It must have been much earlier to 3000 BC. It is so mature a language that it had 4,000 sutras. It has.
ಡ್ಯೂಟಿಯಾ ಡ್ಯೂಟಿ 12 ಗಂಟೆಯಾ
Pradeep, you have to mute. Okay, so the Sanskrit must have been earlier, he says, earlier to the Vedas. Yeah, but Ashtadhyayi was written after the Vedas because the Vedic grammar is different from Panini's grammar. But
Yes.
the whole history of the language was much earlier. So
Yes.
all these Max Muller himself has said. So you're asking whether there is any opposition? Yes, from Max Muller himself.
Yes.
But by 1929, Stanley Baldwin, I quoted this in the last session. Stanley Baldwin was lecturing in British Parliament, 1929. This is 30 years after Max Muller wrote all this. He was still repeating what Max Muller said 75 years earlier.
Oh.
Not only that, in Europe, it played havoc in Europe. The Nazi party and Nazi philosophy was based on the Aryan race theory.
Oh.
If it is so hollow, and you can imagine the consequence of the Aryan theory in Europe was much harsher, much more bloody than it was in India. In India, it created havoc, yes. North and the South, this division. See, the Justice Party in Tamil Nadu, and later it became Dravida Kalagam, and later it became Dravida Munnetra Kalagam. Later it became AIDMK, and all movements are based on, their source of inspiration is Aryan invasion theory. It has created havoc in India in terms of emotional division, yes. But it has also created havoc in Europe. 7 million Jews were killed during the Third Reich, that is under Hitler.
Yes.
From 15 years period, 1933 to 1945, you can say. How much? 12 years.
12 years. 12 years.
So this created havoc in many sense, in many ways. So, and it is hollow. It is hollow. No scientific data supports it. No reasonable, arguments support it.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, sir. So with that, we'll end the session today. So may I request Nagi sir to say the Shanti Mantra.
सर्वे सर्वे सन्तु निरामया सर्वे सन्तु मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग्